Welcome to Preppy Photoshop. Today we're going to learn how to change skin tone naturally. So as you can see here, this image is of a very pale blonde girl, and we're going to make her skin into a more natural tanned dark color. So first off, what we're going to do is we're going to explore some hue saturation options along with curves and selective color. This is how you pretty much change a color in Photoshop. So you go to this menu here and select the hue saturation. And now in this hue saturation, the properties menu will pop up here, and this is where you can decide how to change the color of your image. By dragging this arrow around here, you are just changing the hue, so just the color tone. And as you can see, all the variations in the color change as you drag this around. So today we're not going to use this, but we are going to use this option here called Colorize. Colorize basically changes the whole image into one color. So here in Colorize, you're going to select the hue, and in the hue, we're going to select a natural, more brownish tone that you see in darker skinned individuals. So around this type of orange area, and also bring up the saturation and also darkness. So I know it looks pretty funky. Now she looks very orange, but we're going to adjust that later. But first off, what we need to do is create a base color. And so because we only want to change her skin tone, we don't want to affect the rest of her face and the background. So what we're going to do here is create a mask. So what we can do here is just turn this off real fast and then select the mask around the model. And to make a selection, this might take a little bit of a while, but what I do like to do is just use the magic wand tool real quick to make a large selection. Here we're going to just fill this with black. And as you can see, most of the background has been selected away. Today I'm going to do a more general mask. So I'm just going to use the brush tool. This is actually one of my favorite tools to use mask, but of course selections do take a while. So if you want to make a very accurate selection, you probably have to spend some time. But for the purpose of this video today, I'm just going to do something a little more quick. Okay, so fast forward, and I have our model's skin selected into a mask. And so I know she looks pretty crazy right now. She looks like a Oompa Loompa with this orange skin tone. But the reason why I chose this color is because sometimes people with darker complexions, they actually have a warm base tone. So essentially what we're doing is setting up the base. And by having this orange color as our base, we can mimic the natural warm undertones of a naturally dark skin tone. And so the selection here, I used a combination of the pen tool and the brush tool. And what we want to do is select her skin and not her eyes, her hair, or her clothes. I also selected her lips because the lips naturally will also have a darker undertone if we're going to change her entire skin tone, but we don't want the color of her eyes to change. So what we're going to do next is we are going to use the curve selection tool. What the curves does is, the curves is actually very handy. You can do a lot of things with it, but essentially what we can do is we can manipulate the highlights and the shadows of our person here. By making the bright parts brighter and then the dark parts darker, we can create more variation when we make her skin tone darker, so it'll look more realistic. And then we'd also, for the curves layer, we don't want the rest of the image to be affected. So what we can do, we could just copy the selection we made for the hue saturation layer and then copy it onto the curves layer. selecting it and copy pasting. So what I did is Command and select the curves layer, and then you just want to make this part black, and we can just inverse it so that the curves only affects this area. So next step, like how do we get rid of this orange color? Now we inverse it. Okay, so next step is how do we get rid of this orange color? Well, what we're going to do is selective color. So in selective color, we can actually change the individual hues in a colored image. So for here, the reds, what we can do is either bring up the black, bring down, as you can see, when you bring down the magenta, all the red parts of the image become less red, so now she's more yellow. And then when you bring up the cyan, it makes it a little more blue. And so we're just going to bring up the black a bit. To more natural color. There, it's starting to look a little more natural. And after the reds, because her skin tone was originally very orange, red-orange, that means there's a lot of red areas that we're affecting. So by choosing reds here, we're affecting a lot of the image. But if we go into blues and we just drag this around, as you can see, it's only affecting this area here. So that means the blue parts of the image are being affected. So let's just zero this out, just bring it back to normal, because we still want this blue cast. We don't want to affect the background or her hair or the rest of the image. And so we're going to go to neutrals. Neutrals is grays, and every image has gray. So the neutral tool is really quite powerful because you can affect a lot of the image most of the time. And so what we can do here for the neutral is to add a little more brown into her skin. So as you can see, she's a little bit yellow, but by bringing up the black, it just makes it darker. Maybe we don't want to. I think we want to keep a little more yellow. And as you're changing the color, this is take quite a few layers, because a natural skin tone, it's not particularly easy to mimic because it's part of the real world. When you're in a digital image, the computer really only knows how to make unnatural colors oftentimes. So oftentimes, when you're changing a color of something in Photoshop and you just use 1 or 2 layers, it ends up looking very unnatural. And again, don't forget to apply the selection mask onto each of your layers. So, as you can see, this is a bit of improvement. She still looks pretty crazy, but we'll get there. Okay, and so now if we take a step back and look at our image, I think the very first thing that pops to our eye is that she's way too orange. And so how do we fix this problem? What we can do is bring down the saturation, which is bringing down the color of her skin. So what we can do is just go into hue saturation again and bring down the saturation. This time we don't have to use colorize or anything because we've already basically colored her skin. So the saturation, if we bring it down all the way, she looks very gray. We don't want that. So we want a natural looking dark skin tone. And what we're going to do here is use our judgment and kind of see where we want her to be. So I think this part is pretty good. And this is minus 29 points. Don't forget to copy your selection mask. And there, as you can see, she's already starting to look a little more natural. And the next step is we want to add some variation into her lips. So for here, okay, so I also didn't do the selection mask right. There we go. What we want to do is make her lips a little bit more dark. And again, we can use either brightness contrast or hue saturation, which I prefer for this. So I think I'm just going to use the lightness, bring it down a little bit, and then maybe make it a little more saturated. And for here, I'm just going to inverse this and make this disappear, so all black, and just color her lips in. So this is kind of a learning process. So oftentimes there's no standard way to do this, and you kind of have to judge by yourself depending on the image. So that looks pretty good. Her lips look a little bit darker and then not as flat, so she doesn't look so completely one shade, which is basically what Colorize does. And if we bring more of this color in, and also I think what I want to do here is do the same thing around her eye area. Okay, so as you can see for my selection mask, I did a very quick one, so it's not that accurate and perfect, but naturally we will have a bit of coloration around our eye area. So this is a little bit too much, but we can always bring that back. So just reverse the mask here and soften the edges by using a very soft brush. So when you're working, it's important to just always take a step back and look at the entire image. Just progress from there. So, you know, take a look and see, do things look right? Maybe, as you can see, there's a bit of a blue light cast on the image, so that really disappears when we colorize this. So why don't we bring that back? And what we're going to do to bring that back is just create an empty layer, and we can select this blue area, this light blue color, by holding down Option and selecting part of her hair. And I'm just going to use a brush and paint. So literally this is just me painting on this blue light onto her back. And for this, what we're going to do is choose, not color burn. Okay, that's too much. Maybe a multiply. And then we can just copy this. So what we can do is just copy this mask over here by holding down Option and just dragging it to this layer. So this way the blue is not on the background. I think it kind of worked. Maybe overlay would be better, but still darker here. You know what, I think linear light would be better, and we're just going to make that very low opacity. So now the skin tone is actually really blending into our image. And the next step here is we kind of want to fix this eye area where you can see some of her lighter skin popping out, the waterline mainly. So what we can do here is just use another hue saturation layer and do a colorize. You really want to bring up the saturation here because this waterline area is very light in color, it's almost white. When you bring up the saturation, that would basically colorize the white parts. And I know she looks pretty crazy right now, but once you mask it out, it will make sense. So just make the mask black, inverse it, and color in her waterline. It might, actually right now, it might be a little too saturated, so I'm just gonna bring it down to 61. And bring down the darkness a bit. just to add some shadow. So this way it actually looks like her eyeballs aren't popping out. Okay, so now it's still a little bit too orange, so we're just going to add another layer, maybe a curves layer, and just bring down the, it's still a little orange, but just bring down the color of the entire image, inverse it. And also notice that people with dark skin, sometimes they don't have super white, the whites of their eyes aren't super white like this edited photo. Nobody has perfectly white eyes, but what we can do here in that case is use another hue saturation layer and colorize and add a little bit yellow. So I don't want to make this any lighter or darker, but inverse that and add a little bit into her eyes, a yellow into her eyes. Might be a little too yellow, a little more orange. There. Okay, so let's take a look. And she's starting to look pretty good, but I still feel like her skin's a little bit orange. And we can go back into our previous layers and change that just by affecting the saturate. Oh, this is the lips. So it's also important to label your layers. So I'm just going to do that here. And so this is skin tone 1. What we can do is lower the saturation a little bit more. There. I think she looks a little more natural now. And there. A little more dusky. Now I'm looking at this image and the skin tone looks pretty natural, but what's missing from it is that the oiliness of a natural skin. So for here, what we're going to do is we're going to add some highlights and some shadows to bring back some of that texture. And when I'm talking about oiliness, it's just that skin naturally produces oils, and so when you see this type of matte look, it doesn't look right. Like, because her skin was so light before, you don't notice it as much, but now that we changed the color of her skin, we have to bring that back in a little bit. And what we can do is we can do a brightness contrast. So add a little bit brightness, reverse that, and we're just going to add a little bit brightness into the tops of her cheeks. Nose bridge, this area here. And the top of her lips here. So we also don't want these kind of shadows to show, so just blend through, blend the edges of the areas you drew in. Bring a little bit here. And we're going to do her body as well. So what we can do here is add a little bit highlight, shoulder, and her collarbone. So it's the areas where you think look lighter than the rest. Just soften those edges. And I'm just using the brush tool. So as you can see, she already looks a little bit better. She looks a little more 3D. And another thing that we can do is add some shadows. Instead of adding shadows using the brightness contrast, I want to create an empty layer and color them in. So I'm going to go back to the brush tool, choose the shadow area, and what we get is this like nice kind of terracotta color, and I'm just going to draw in some shadow. Not a lot, but just a little bit to give her a little more definition. So be careful about when you're drawing, but as you can see, when I was drawing, it definitely hit some areas that I didn't want to draw on. But that's okay because we can just erase that in a minute. Okay, and since you can't really see this, we're going to set the blending mode to multiply. And now it looks a little bit crazy, but that's okay. So because we get these like weird funky shapes from our drawing, we can add a blur effect. You go into Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and just blur it quite a bit. And there we go. And add a mask and mask out the areas you don't want the shadow to affect. So right here, here, a little bit here, and just to soften. And there. And so that's about it. You could keep going, and if I were to keep working on this image, of course I would fix up some of the selection here, but this is quite time consuming. But of course, if you were actually doing this for a project or whatever reason, you would probably have to go in and mask out each of these individual hairs. And unfortunately, I couldn't even use a channel selection for this because her skin tone before was already super pale white, and her white hair is just blends into it. And so that's about it. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll be happy to answer them. And also, if you want to see anything else, just comment below. Okay, thanks for watching.